Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is the writer Ben Raines. For 18 years, Ben Raines was a prize-winning environmental reporter for the Mobile newspaper. Now, in the last 3 years, he has published 2 books on Alabama environment and history. In 2020, we had Saving America's Amazon, which examines the perilous situation into which we have carelessly put Alabama's rich natural heritage. And in 2022, The Last Slave Ship, telling the story of the Clotilda, which Raines found. I spoke with Ben Raines in Studio UA in the Digital Media Center on the campus of the University of Alabama. Ben, it is nice to see you again.
It's wonderful to see you, Don. Thank you for having me.
The last time we chatted, only briefly, you were in Monroeville at a conference, and you're talking about an environmental project that you had going at the time. And we didn't speak for long, but of course, this is my first father-son interview, because I have a couple of times interviewed Howell, your dad, a fine writer, and the genes are carrying on just fine.
Well, and you two knew each other here in Tuscaloosa in the 60s, so that's an amazing connection.
And this is an idea I had last night. I never have seen a television interview show dedicated to anyone, but we shall dedicate this half hour to our friend Ed Wilson.
Mm-hmm. Who was at that conference in Monroeville where we met.
Yes, and he was a big part of your
Absolutely.
a big part of your environmental writing life,
Huge
and also wrote the
inspiration
introduction
to me,
for Saving America's Amazon. We will spend most of our time, I'm sure, talking about the Clotilda, but let's not pass over Saving America's Amazon without some kind of mention. I read it. I was astonished. I'm always astonished. And when Dr. Wilson would say there are 7 million kinds of ants or whatever, I was oh really? There are 77,000 miles of water, fresh water in Alabama.
In Alabama, it leads the nation, which you wouldn't expect because we're such a small state in comparison.
Yes, and we think, who gets credit for the Mississippi anyway? Everybody?
Well, not Alabama, but the Mississippi, what's special about our rivers is they have so many species. We lead the nation in the diversity of aquatic creatures. And the Mississippi, by comparison, is really kind of a poor man's river. The habitats don't change the way they do here. Our rivers start up in the foothills of the Appalachians and go all the way to the coast. So they're much more diverse.
I'm not sure whether I saw it in your book, or perhaps it was John Sledge's book, but that little chunk of Alabama in the northwest corner is ours because of the Tennessee River.
Yeah.
The sheriff in Mississippi was unable to maintain law and order.
Oh, he couldn't get across
on his side, on our side of the river. So they just said, "Why don't you just have that?" Uh-huh. So rivers have shaped the boundaries in a way that we would not have expected.
Well, one of the last times I was with Ed Wilson, he gave me an idea for a novel, and he said, "I will deny it if you tell anybody this is my idea." But since he's passed on, and the idea for the novel was to take back the chunk of the Florida Panhandle that's below Alabama, and he wanted the Alabama, the Alabama Guard to take it over, and the people in Florida would be given, or what was formerly Florida, would be given no taxes for the rest of their lives, and so Alabama would defend this chunk of the Redneck Riviera and reclaim it in Ed's vision.
Well, seceding over and over is a part of the tradition here. I mean, Free County, Winston, and the state, and even you would hear it once in a while now, mostly from Texas, but sometimes Alabamians talk about how they're tired of taking all that money from New York State.
Yeah, the Alabamians talk about a lot of things that aren't necessarily the best for them.
The crux of the book, I mean, after a really lively demonstration of of the variety of flora and fauna. The shocking and distressing part of your book is that the Alabama Environmental Protection Agency hardly exists.
ADEM.
And it's almost counterproductive. And I read that and I thought at first, surely not. Surely this can't be true.
Well, in some measures, it's really a permitting factory, and it was created to streamline the permitting process for industry. That was the origin of ADEM. And you know, in its entire history, it has been the least funded environmental agency in the country, out of all 50 states. So here we are the #1 leader in diversity per square mile. We have twice as many plants and animals per square mile. We have 450 species of freshwater fish. That is a third of all the freshwater fish in the entire nation. You know, California has 110. We have 150 in the Cahaba River alone. So we have all this diversity, but we're also #1 in extinctions. Alabama has more extinctions than any other state in the continental U.S. In fact, we have more than half of all the extinctions in the U.S. since the 1850s. Okay. So you can't be both. We can't, you know, be the kings of diversity and the kings of extinction forever. And it all boils down to that environmental agency not doing its job.
All right. The best, this is a question, it's almost unfair by definition, but why should Alabamians, aside from the aesthetics and the principle of the thing, they're pro-life, why should Alabamians care about the extinction of snails or minnows or tiny newts that they don't even know about? And there is an answer, but everybody's answer is slightly different.
I'll give you two answers, and one of them was something Ed came to later in his life, is they're all God's creatures, and we should not be wiping them off of the earth. But more importantly, we don't know what we do when we wipe a creature off of the earth. Right. If you look at our salt marshes, there's a little snail in them called the marsh periwinkle. It is about the size of a marble or a gumball. And if you go in a marsh, almost every stalk of marsh grass will have a periwinkle going up and down it. If you remove those snails from the marsh dies. And you would think, why? Well, because those snails spend their lives going up and down those blades of marsh grass, eating the algae off that grows when the tide comes up. If that algae doesn't get eaten off, the plant can't photosynthesize because there's so much algae it can't get any sun. So when we take any species out of the ecosystem, we don't know what chain of events we're unlocking.
Yeah.
And that's why.
Years ago, I was speaking with Verda Horn, who was a very active Alabama environmentalist. She was in town and she gave a lecture on environment and extinction. And you know, you may have known her, in fact, but she was an earnest older woman, and she said there are plants in the jungle that can cure cancer. And it would be a good thing if we didn't kill all those plants before we found which plant had the cure for cancer. And I remember the audience thinking,
absolutely.
That's a good idea.
And you know, this book is about the river system, the Alabama river system that starts up above Birmingham and goes all the way to the coast. We are still finding new plants in that system all the time, unknown to science, new species, let alone knowing what medicinal powers they might have.
Right,
you know,
right.
And so one of the things E.O. Wilson used to always say about it is as untapped as the wilds of Borneo. It is so little known by scientists. Yeah. And you know, how incredible that we have this jewel here in the state. Yeah. And really that book was kind of my love letter to this place. I was born in Alabama. All my extended family on both sides is here. They all would tell you, I love the environment, but none of them had any idea that the stuff in this book, and neither did I. My mother, when I wrote the book, she said to me, you have to quit saying Alabama has more species of this or that. You sound like a crazy person. And you know, she's a Tuscaloosa native.
Well, reading something like that, it causes me to cast my mind back, and I'm thinking when I was a kid, if anybody had asked me, which no one did, I would have said that we had discovered pretty much all the species on the planet that there were to discover. Yeah. And I would have said that in 1955 or whatever. Right. And then you talk with Wilson yesterday, and he said, oh no, we're discovering new species every day.
He found a new species of ant in the Delta while he was out on my boat. Right. And it was just a magical thing to be a part of.
Now, in this will happen. I'm casting our conversation ahead a few minutes. The natives, the people who founded Africa Town, and the people who lived there, and some who still do, we'll circle back to industrial pollution.
Sure.
But let's move on to the Clotilda. It has been known for ages that there was such a ship, that it was the last ship to go to Africa, capture or buy already enslaved people and bring them back. And it was known, I think, for 100 years, well before even
160 years. It was known from the day
that it
they
was
got
burned
back.
and
Yeah.
sunk.
Yep.
Okay. One of the things about your book that really knocked me out, I thought, I did not know this, is the kingdom of Dahomey. I thought, this is the most savage spot in the world.
And I think in world history, it may have been the most murderous regime ever.
Describe that society, that culture, with the Amazons.
I will. So the Dahomey is in the modern day country, Benin, the Republic of Benin, which sits right next to Nigeria. And it's a small country. In fact, it's almost exactly the square footage of Alabama. So the way to think of the Dahomeyan Empire is if you took one county in Alabama, let's say Baldwin County, and made that the Dahomeyan Kingdom. They spent the next 300 years attacking every other county in this area the size of the state, and they kidnapped 3 to 8 million people and sold them into slavery. That country, the Dahomeyans, their entire existence, their economy was based solely on multiple annual raids where they would go out and destroy other kingdoms. They would, when they went to a neighboring kingdom, like the kingdom that Cudjo Lewis was from,
Yes.
Bante, they attacked in the middle of the night, and it was a fortified city that he lived in, had walls around it and gates. They attacked in the middle of the night, and the people who did the attacking were the Amazons. So this is if you saw the movie Black Panther with the female warriors for Wakanda, they were based on the Amazons from Dahomey. So the way this happened, the Dahomeyan kings, it passed down to the son. So there was a king who was a twin. He had a twin sister. And when he died, his sister decided to take over the throne. So she surrounded herself with a group of female warriors so no one would know she was a woman. Well, that force grew, and it became the most fierce fighting force in the country because they were all out to best the men and everything. And so then the subsequent kings kept this all-female force. So they were the raiders. The men of the army, and the army of Dahomey at the time was about 50,000 people, if you can imagine, attacking these small villages, 50,000 people. The women would scale the walls of the villages, run inside, and start literally cutting everyone's heads off. They killed everyone who wasn't slaving age. They killed children. Anybody who was below about 12 or over about 30, they just murdered them on the spot. Yes. So then the people they were not killing, the targeted people to be enslaved, would run out of the gates of the village and be captured by the men who were waiting outside. So that's what this country was. And the legacy of that across the centuries is still all over in Benin. There's a village called Ganvi that's out in the middle of a lake, and the village is 5 miles from shore. The Tofinu tribe moved out there in 1704 to escape the Dahomeyans because the Dahomeyans won't attack. They wouldn't travel over water before attacking because of their native religion, which is called Vodun. What's voodoo? This is where voodoo came from and spread to Louisiana and the Caribbean and South America. So these people are still out there today. This tribe still lives in the middle of this lake. There are 50,000 people out there now in this floating village.
Better safe than sorry.
Exactly.
They're still out there.
So when the Clotilda, when Timothy Mayer from Alabama, the steamboat captain, decided to try and bring people, bring in slaves, he sent the ship straight to Dahomey because it was being written about in the Mobile Press Register in 1859, saying that Ouida, the port of Ouida in Dahomey is back in business because it had temporarily gotten out of the slave business due to a treaty with England, and said you can procure a load there in a matter of minutes. And so it was globally famous as a place to go get slaves from the 1600s on.
A couple of little things that that struck me. You go along, you think, ooh. One of the things was these people, the Dahomeyans, were crazy for beheading people. They beheaded everybody they didn't capture. They beheaded, and then they hauled the heads back to their home village.
Yep. Tied them together on ropes. And Cujo Lewis writes or talked about having to see people he knew from his village after they'd marched for 9 days. The heads started to stink. So the Dahomeyans made a huge fire and made all the captives just sit there while they smoked the heads for 3 days over the fire. And he talks about watching people he knew, watching their faces shrivel up, and it's just brutal to
And
imagine.
heads were used for decoration in the home village.
They were on the walls, fortifying the village. The king's throne sat on top of skulls of kings he had killed from other places. You know, these people, English naval officers that visited in the 1850s, talked about the grand custom. And this was this annual celebration. Honoring your ancestors is a big deal in the Vodun culture. And it's a big deal in Benin today, even among Christians and Muslims, as a legacy. This guy that was there the year before the Clotilda arrived said that they killed 250 people during the big voodoo celebration to honor the king's dead father.
This was ritualistic killing for no reason.
Some of
no
them they killed very
warfare,
slowly.
no
Right.
legal system.
They were sacrifices.
Just right. All right. And we don't have time for everything, but it was interesting to me that the tribes in Benin are now reconciling. The tribes that
they're trying.
They're trying. There's the Dahomeyans who killed everybody else, and everybody else whose ancestors were killed by the Dahomeyans, and they have to work that out.
Yeah, well, so in that country, you have all sides of slavery. Everybody who is in that country today is either a descendant of the Dahomeyans, the Fan, the tribe that was killing everybody, or all the tribes they captured. And they're all still there. And so some of the tribes that were captured won't send their kids to school with the Dahomeyans. They won't shop in stores. And now they're the Fan tribe, but they won't, so they're trying to avoid the Rwandan genocide, which was a tribal conflict that got out of control. And they're talking about reparations, and doing something for the victims of slavery, just like we are here in this country. The president of Benin right now was attacked during the last election for having slave dealers in his family tree. And guess what? He is a mega millionaire built on a cotton fortune. That's just it's a full circle, right?
There are some odd parallels going on. All right, moving back across the Atlantic.
Back to Alabama. All right.
All right. Mayor he is, every time I read about Antebellum, Alabama, in Sledge's book, and it doesn't matter where you go, or Flint or Sledge, you're always astonished at how rich the rich people were. And this man was extraordinarily rich. To the cost of an individual, let's say male between 12 and 30 was anywhere in modern money around $50,000.
Yeah, in the South.
In the South.
Now in the Northeast, they were a fraction of that, a quarter of the price in, say, Maryland or Virginia. But yeah, $50,000.
And it cost him $1 million in contemporary money to send his expedition, the ship, and return with, as it was, 110.
Now, he didn't do this because he needed
No.
new enslaved people. He did this to win a bet.
Right.
He made a bet on the deck of his steamboat one night, drunk, talking to some Yankees, because there was another case going on where another boat had been captured in Georgia bringing slaves in. And he was, the Yankees were saying they should hang them all. And he said, nonsense, they'll hang nobody. I can do this myself. I'll bet you $1,000, which was $30,000 in today's money. And he did it.
And he did it. All right. The voyage there fraught with discipline problems, crew rebellions, and all kinds of shenanigans. They purchase the cargo, they put it in the hold. It's horrible. The Middle Passage is often, there's nothing to say about it. That's, in that sense, it's just awful.
Well, one of the interesting things about the Clotilda story is many of our stories about the Middle Passage actually come from the Clotilda, because nobody had experienced the Middle Passage after 1808, because that was outlawed, bringing new slaves in. So that's one of the amazing things about this, is we get so many stories out of the mouths of enslaved people.
They were first-hand reports of the Middle Passage.
Right.
Anything previous had been passed down from generation.
Right.
Yes. He gets them ashore. He hides them in the swamp. He burns and sinks his ship. And then only, well, what was it? Less than 5 years later, the war is over and they are free. They are emancipated. One of the things that struck me at that point in the book was that group who founded Africatown, they had skills. They had administrative, organizational, judicial skills.
Well, they had been free.
Nobody, no other enslaved black people in America had it.
Yeah. And in some measure, because they had been free people, you know, their families had owned property, they had run businesses, they were used to dealing with money. So when they were suddenly emancipated, they said, okay, and so they did the businesses they did back home. They started growing food, they started making furniture, making baskets. And so they became kind of a model for American-born blacks who had been emancipated, who didn't necessarily have those skills because they had never experienced freedom. All of their labors had always been stolen. And so Africatown, this town that the Africans created on land they bought from the people who had enslaved them, became kind of a mecca. And it started growing like gangbusters as soon as they built the town. So that by, that was 1870. By 1912, it was the fourth largest African-American governed community in America. Yeah. And it was the only one started by Africans.
Reading that section on their organizational skills, I thought to myself, I paused there and I thought, those skills are not innate. The slave, a man who in 1865 was, say, 23, he'd been 18 when he left Benin, Dahomey. He remembered how to organize a government, how to run how to keep law and order, and so on.
Yeah. And his grandfather had been a part of the king's ruling group, and so he had exposure to leadership, and he was being trained as a warrior.
Yeah, and Cujo in particular.
Yeah.
Yes,
and
right.
many of the others were as well. So here you have this group of Africans who've been trained as warriors, and even when they were enslaved, one of the things about them was that they fought back. Everybody was used to dealing with American-born enslaved people by that time. People who had been born into it, grown up knowing I'm a slave, there's nothing I can do about it. That's not how the Africans felt. They weren't a slave just before. Right. Most of the time, people when they were brought into this country, the Middle Passage, were immediately sold, and they had no connection to anyone. The Africans, many of them were from the same village. Yeah. And when they brought them here, 30 of them were sold, but the other 80 were split among 4 plantations. And those 4 plantations were 3 owned by the Mayer brothers and then one of their friends. And the Mayers had all these steamboats. And so people like Cujo, who ended up working on the steamboat, they saw their friends on these other plantations weekly, and they stayed in touch. So while they were enslaved, here you have these people, some of whom had grown up together or whatever. So they're working in the field right after they arrived in America. One of Mayer's overseers whips a woman in the cotton field, and the Africans attacked him and took the whip and beat him with it. And Cujo says famously, they never whipped the African women no more after that.
Yes, right.
And there was another instance where one of the Mayer's paid cooks hit one of the African girls. She was trying to teach how to sweep. Yes. And she let out a blood-curdling scream, and all the Africans came running in from the fields carrying the hoes and sling blades they had out working, stormed into the house, and actually Mayer's wife and that cook locked themselves in a bedroom while the Africans stood outside chanting and threatening them. So, that's a different story than you've heard about.
It certainly is. It is when you see the chronology and the literal physical movement in space, it all makes sense. Yeah. It's just odd until it's contextualized properly, and you say, "Oh, no, wait a minute, they ran their own right. lives yesterday."
And because they had all those connections through growing up together or knowing each other since they were in the Barracoon. After they were freed, they came back together, and that's how they ended up making Africatown.
Africatown, there's a long section on the rise and the fall, and this is where we circle back sadly to something loosely like pollution, greed, industrialization, poisoning, toxic waste, the very same thing that's trying to kill the Mobile
Absolutely.
Delta really did seriously damage Africatown.
Well, and Africatown was clearly a victim of systemic racism at the state and federal, or not federal, state, the city and state level. Mobile and the state of Alabama, with the Mayer family, conspired to basically destroy Africatown. And you know, the part of its rise was these giant factories they built there, the largest paper mill in the world, and gave everybody jobs.
Yeah.
They didn't understand it was simultaneously poisoning them, incredible high rates of cancer and everything.
Right.
And so over the years, because the Africans bought their land from Timothy Mayer as part of his plantation, they were surrounded on all sides by other land Timothy Mayer owned. Today, his descendants, who still own all that land, are busily rezoning properties in Africatown from residential to heavy industrial.
So the situation will get worse.
It very much, unless we can get the city of Mobile to just quit rezoning properties in Africatown. We have this moment right now where we've found the ship. There are only 13 slave ships ever found out of the 20,000 that were used in the global trade. There's never been another one found that was a part of the American trade. So we have this incredible artifact, important on a global scale. And the state of Alabama has not promised they'll dig it up yet. They keep hedging, saying, well, we may not be able to dig it up. We may just have to put a concrete pier there at the site, and people can go stand on the pier like they're at the battleship, you know, in
Arizona.
Yeah, in Pearl Harbor. Well, no, we can dig this ship up. All it takes is money. Anybody who doesn't see the power of this artifact sitting in a museum, you know, they look at the Legacy Museum in Montgomery. It is now a nationally recognized museum,
absolutely.
$1 billion impact to that community. So here's Africatown, where the city in 1992 built a gigantic highway through the heart of town, destroyed all of the buildings built by the Africans. You know, the cabins they built that their descendants were still living in. The city took them through eminent domain and wiped them off the map, and wiped out Africatown's central business district. Well, now's the time to bring it back. We put a world-class museum there with a ship in it.
Bring
Win
the ship
for
up,
Alabama.
build a museum around it, and if you do that, they will come.
Exactly. They will come.
We don't even have a minute. So,
All right.
as it happens, it always happens. You are working on 2 or 3 books at the same time. Loosely speaking, what are they about?
Well, I'd rather take my minute talking about my next project, which should come out in April, I believe.
What is it?
Which is a new documentary about pitcher plant bogs, Alabama's carnivorous plants.
Oh,
We
yes.
have more species of carnivorous plants, plants that eat meat, than anywhere else in the country. We have more species of pitcher plants than anywhere else in the world. So this is a 4K macro video adventure that I think people are going to love. Look for it on Alabama Public TV toward the end of April.
Well, congratulations on finding, at last, the ship. And we'll look for the video, and when the day comes that the books are published, we'll sit and talk about them too.
I would love to come back. I would love
Thank
to
you,
come
Ben.
back.
This has been a real delight.
Thank you so much for having me, Don.